Record. Okay, let's go. Okay, so welcome to webinar 6, Concluding Not Ending, in which we will indeed conclude this webinar series but not end the concept of having a webinar series, and I'll get to that later. We'll talk today about how to conclude without letting your readers down, and you'll notice that a lot of what I've got to say in this webinar series has been about focusing on your readers, or expecting that your readers may not be able to follow you if you don't provide a coherent framework or enough guidance for them. This month, I guess, we'll talk about a few things. The 2 types of conclusions. That's actually not as difficult as it seems, and it's also not related to academic paper conclusions. Only one element of that is about the concluding section of the paper. How to draw conclusions effectively, that means how to logically end your argument or end your description or end your analysis of data. And I'll give an example of that. And we'll talk about leaving a lasting impression in the concluding section of the paper. And finally, do a quick recap of the webinar and the series. And as I said, mention another series that will be running soon. Okay, and as I said just before, never forget your readers. That's always going to be the focus, and has been the focus right from the start of this series, and it's going to be the focus again today. Okay, so there are 2 types of conclusions. As I said, a conclusion is an endpoint. It's the last thing. It's where it all ends, but it shouldn't just end. A paper or an argument or even a sentence should never just end. So it can be one of 2 things. Okay, so a conclusion is the last part. You know, the conclusion of a series, the conclusion of a book, the conclusion of an argument between 2 people, the conclusion of anything is the end. But that can be broken down into 2 broad things that you can see here on the screen. Now, there's one about summarizing and one about logic. We looked at summarizing last time. Let's think about the logic bit first. Okay, so a conclusion is the end of a process of logic, starting with premise, working logically up to the conclusion. If your premise is correct, your conclusion is more or less preordained. It always has to be a certain way. And within that scope, we can talk about conclusions being drawn. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean they have to be in the concluding section of your paper. You draw conclusions all the time throughout a paper. When you summarize in the introduction, when you summarize in the literature review, there's always a conclusion there somewhere. When you're discussing results, even a small subset of results, you're drawing conclusions all the time, and you do that so the reader can follow through with you. You might even say that when we look back at those paragraphs that we looked at a few months ago, the last sentence or the last end connecting sentence of the paragraph is a conclusion in itself. Also, the summary at the end of the paper, usually it can vary from a paragraph for some people in the humanities and in some of the hard sciences, or a whole paragraph, a whole series of paragraphs, an entire long section. It can be for some other people conclusion and discussion. Okay, that's when you conclude the paper. That's when you wrap everything up. So we'll look at both of those today. First, let's think about drawing conclusions. A conclusion should always, as I said before, be the climax of a logical process. It should in itself be logical. Let's have a look at what it needs to do. It should inform your readers. Okay, there is no point in drawing a conclusion or kind of summarizing results without informing. It should give them something of an aha moment of one sort or another. And by that I mean it should make them think, oh yes, that's how it all ties together. That's how all this information that I've just been given ties together. A conclusion well drawn rather, is information delivered. Just think about this for a moment. there has to be something more than the information itself, because we will never get that aha moment if there isn't something else, there isn't some value added to that information. And that is obviously going to be some sort of interpretation or some sort of grounding in the wider sphere, the wider scope of your field. Give you an example of what I mean by this. Here's a conclusion that's particularly well drawn. It's a little bit long, but I just want you to have a look at it. This is from a paper that's discussing whether or not increases in crime reported actually correlate to increases of people being victims of crime. Okay, and so I'll just read it really quickly because it's not difficult. Altogether, we cannot accept without question the dramatic increase in recorded crime as corresponding to a real increase in victimization of the same proportions. However good it would be to explain the increase as an artifact of recording changes, this cannot be shown to be the case. I just want to stop there. There's been a big debate about whether or not increases in apparent crime rates in Western countries, at least, I know in my own country in Australia, whether or not that's related to the fact that more recording is better now than it used to be. Anyway, back to the topic. We can plausibly infer that crime has been increasing in the last 2 to 3 decades, presenting a problem for explanation of policy. So what this person is saying is, I've given you the information. This is the only thing that we can draw from that information. We cannot say for certain whether there are more victims of crime now. What we can say is that in the last 2 to 3 decades, crime has been increasing, and we need to consider more why that's the case. So the key elements of this are that it limits the scope of discussion. As I said before, it doesn't bring in any new information. It makes a judgment based on available facts. The judgment is here plausibly infer. And as I said, it introduces no new information. So a conclusion in this sense, in a kind of a running sense, the sort of thing that you will write throughout your paper. Someone can't hear me. And everyone else hear me. I'm just checking to see if everyone can hear, because, okay, Harry can. In this case, I know I've got the microphone on this time because I can see it moving, unlike last time. It might be best if you try to, there's a few others that have said yes, try to log out and log back in, and that can get rid of the problem. This might have something to do with this new way that they've got to testing your microphone and so on. I found I have 2 headsets connected to this computer, and sometimes it picks up the wrong headset when I log in to GoToMeeting. Okay, so let me get back to the point. So what we have here is a self-contained argument, essentially. It's an addition to the description of the information you've given. It doesn't give any new information. It's a very small scope, and it makes a judgment based on available facts. So when you're going through writing descriptions, and this will become important at the end of your paper as well, when you're going through and writing descriptions and you just want to summarize what you've got to say, you need to somehow make that judgment, limit the scope of what you're arguing about, and say, this is all that we can pick up from this information. And sometimes, like in a science paper, that will be obvious because you're listing point by point. And we'll see an example towards the end of this webinar of an engineering paper in which we can do just that. So the takeaway from this particular example is ensure your conclusions are logical endpoints. They give no more information. They draw something from the information to make a more general point. so your readers can understand them. A conclusion well drawn situates your argument, says, here I am. And you can see that's the kind of the Google Maps or the Apple Maps or whatever, little icon pointing exactly where you are. If you want to think back to the the elevator rather, I had when I was talking about paragraph writing in an earlier webinar, it will indicate what floor you're on, what part of your argument you've reached as you're moving up the building with the logical structure of your paper. But I just wanted to treat this in a more general sense for the moment. So now that we've got that kind of basis worked out, where a conclusion should be limited, but it should add something to the information, and it should be a logical endpoint for that information, or a logical point, a logical way of pointing to the future. Let's have a look at one of the biggest problems about academic papers is quite often they just end. Let's think about the conclusions of the whole papers. As I say, different fields have different expectations. I'm not going to discuss the broad array. I've already mentioned in brief that there are different types of conclusions ranging from one paragraph to many, from part of a continuous stream of writing to a specific section at the end of a paper. This time, I just want to look at the kind of commonalities there. They should have that one thing in common, one thing only. They shouldn't just end. And unfortunately, many of them do. When I first started editing, let me think, that would have been about, I've been 16 years in AH editing, so that would be about 17.5 years ago. The first thing I recognized was that so many papers just ended and the readers just left hanging. What else? What does this all mean? What are the implications? Okay, many of you have to write implications and future research directions, but sometimes they are so, for some people they are so limited or so, off the shelf that they don't give any direction. So a conclusion is your last chance to convince readers about your argument or about the information you've given or about the value of your model, as we'll see in a short while, or about any of the really important aspects of your paper. So here's one that leaves the reader hanging, and this is what I mean. Okay, this is from an engineering paper. It's about civil engineering, traffic model. As you can see, it's a independent section, but it's also only a paragraph. It's a little bit technical, but basically it's about a model and how the model has been used within the paper. And I'll quickly go through the main points. They've built a predictive continuum dynamic user optimum model to study the traffic equilibrium problem for a polycentric urban city, meaning a city with numerous urban centers. Hong Kong is one of those cities. If you want to look further afield, say Washington in the US is one, Beijing. Canberra in Australia is a classic case of that, where there are many different what they call city centers within the city itself. Anyway, the model satisfies the predictive user equilibrium principle and consists of two interconnected parts. We won't worry about them, with different initial times. We regard the model as a fixed point problem and use a self-adaptive MSA, which automatically can determine the optimal MSA size to solve it. Okay, so we're seeing a lot of description here, and you would expect that in the conclusion of any paper. You're going back through the information that you've provided. You're reminding the reader of the different points that you've covered. Sometimes this can be way too detailed, and it can go on and on and on. And I see reviewer reports saying, "Well, you don't need to actually say this much. You need to give a broad outline and then think about the consequences of what you've written or the implications of what you've written." Anyway, the finite volume method is applied to solve the conservation equations and the Hamilton-Jacobi equations on unstructured meshes. The results show that the numerical algorithm is effective. So you could say that, well, that's kind of okay because it's shown that the algorithm that they use works. Now, we don't have a great deal of information to go on here because we're only looking at their conclusion, but you need to presume that you've already taken all that in. So yeah, the results show that the numerical algorithm is effective. Yeah, but it's kind of traffic modeling for a whole town, you know, a whole city. So you need to kind of say something more. You need to say, does it work for the whole city? So there's something seems to be missing. Something seems to be left implied, or something seems to be saying, something in this conclusion says, I just got to the end and I didn't worry about it too much and I bunged it out and someone accepted it. Actually, this paper wasn't accepted. Bunged it out and someone's accepted it. The reader can kind of work it out for themselves, but you know, sometimes the reader just has lost interest by that stage. At other times, as I said earlier in this series, not everyone reads papers straight down, okay? A lot of people will read the abstract, the introduction, look at the details, the methods really quickly, go to the conclusion and see what's happened. Now, if they go to that conclusion and see that end sentence, they'll know that your algorithm is effective, but you know, there are going to be very few papers in which the last sentence will be, the algorithm is not effective. So let's see what we can do with it. We need to leave a lasting impression. We need, at the most base level, to say why something is relevant, why your paper is relevant. The very last sentence is crucial, and so many people just leave it aside. So I've just cut this down so we don't have to read through the whole thing again. In fact, only the last sentence has changed. All I did was I went back to the information that was available in the paper and added one part of the last sentence, and that's the numerical results. That it's slightly changed, and I didn't put that in italics, show that the model can describe the macroscopic dynamic characteristics of the traffic flow for a polycentric city, and that the numerical algorithm is effective. So this information here gives practical relevance. So what that says to the reader, sorry for my really poor underlining, what that says to the reader is this can actually be applied in real life. This can do something. It's not quite the kind of you know, limited kind of conclusion that we do when we're drawing a conclusion. It's a lot more concrete. It's a lot more, yes, not only does this model work, but you can use it, and that's the implication. So all it needed was a touch of practical relevance, and that's clearly what all papers need, and so few of them have toward the end. If you are a person who writes within that framework of needing to write implications for for management, for practice, for the academia, and then you know, areas for future research. When you write your areas for future research, you need to relate why that's important. A lot of people just say, okay, this area is needed to be investigated further. Why? Because your readers might not understand, might not realize that. And that's how you leave the lasting impression. That's how you make them say, aha, that's what we need to do next as a field, or that's what I could do next as a person. And that's why people read more of your papers. Because if you don't leave a lasting impression, you won't have much of an impact. So takeaway 2 is always conclude with context. Okay, the why question, the how question, you know, answering the why question and the how question. Again, it's sitting on a map. You need to be able to show how it's relevant to the reader, how the reader can see your information can be applied around them in their field. So readers know where you have arrived and where they could be to, or where they could move on from. So that's all all I really want to cover today in the conclusions. And basically, again, there's 2 points. There were 3 points. that a conclusion is the end of a logical process, always a logical process. If your conclusion B doesn't follow from your premise A, then you are not going to get published, or you will get published and people will quickly find the flaw in your argument. You need to give your readers that aha moment when drawing a conclusion throughout the paper. And when you're concluding your paper, don't just end. Give it context. Give it something that a person can say, this is where the paper's brought me mentally. This is what I need to do next, or this is what the field can do next. Or, just as importantly, as you will all know, this is how I can use the information in this paper or the findings in this paper, for my research project, for my thesis perhaps, for anything else that I'm doing. Let's look now over the rest of the series, because these things all tie in together. There's my little man, never leaves me alone. What I said throughout this webinar applies to every webinar, and I've continued with it all the time. Readers matter. You need to give your readers an aha moment. You need to give your readers somewhere where they're going to, an indication of where you've arrived. You need to give your readers in earlier webinars an indication of where you're going at working with paragraphs and themes. You need to give your readers an indication of the importance of your information when we talked about clarity. Clarity counts. Clarity is the essence of what you need, what you're doing. Clarity doesn't mean it has to be simple and you don't have to dumb it down. Clarity means making sure you say what you think you're saying and saying it in a way that readers within your field can understand. And of course, for those of you who write across fields, well, readers across different fields can understand. And finally, and it's something that applies in every form of writing, themes sharpen your message. Now, just to quickly reiterate, themes are not something imposed from above. They're something that give guidance to everyone who reads and give guidance when you write. You need a theme. Newspapers call it an angle. Okay, I do writing for academic units like public relations officers and things like that. They'll always, for instance, we write for the Poly Milestones magazine here, which is the research magazine of the Hong Kong Polytechnic University. Every article I write for them has to have an angle. It has to have a way of showing the information. And that's the same for academic papers. You need to have that angle going through your paper. You need to have the small themes and the larger theme to make sure that everyone really gets what you want to say. Now, if anyone has any questions, just butt in and write them if you can't access your microphone. None of the microphones are turned off, so feel free to turn them on and ask questions. While you're thinking about that, I just want to mention something else. One last thing. This is not going to end here. We are concluding, but we're not ending. Over the years, we've done multiple types of webinars, seminars, workshops. Our next one is on effective thesis writing. Now, I'm not sure if this is going to apply to any of you here now, but if you have students, you can certainly let them know. We'll be doing it in a very much more constricted format. We'll be doing it in 2 webinars across probably a month, so 2 weeks, 2 weeks after or 3 weeks after the other one. They will be longer. They'll probably be about half an hour, because in this webinar, the dates will be announced soon, within the month. Excuse me. As you know, for this series, it's been more of a focus on the broad elements of writing. For the effective thesis writing series will be more about the structure. So it'll be more about, okay, this is your introduction and this is your literature review and so on. And these are the problems we find because we edit very many theses all the time. I think we've probably got about 4 or 5 on the go at the moment, and they're always turning over through our workflow. So we are looking to kind of help in that way to say this is the problem, these are the problems we found, this is how they can be fixed. Once again, it'll be a free webinar series. This is for us to help you, not for us to make any money out of course. Oops, and that's going the right. So until then, if you're going to join that one, and we will be in touch, thank you very much for joining this series. And I've actually had quite a lot of fun delivering it. I'm not used to talking into the webcam all the time, but it's been great. And thank you for the feedback that some of you have sent through email to Peter as well. And hopefully we'll see you next time. Bye for now.